The scene that unfolded between Washington and Ottawa this morning wasn't merely a breakdown in communication, it was a fundamental fracturing of the most successful bilateral partnership in modern history. We aren't looking at a standard diplomatic rift or a temporary cooling of relations. Instead, we are witnessing a high-stakes collision between an immovable object and an unstoppable force, where the very concept of negotiation has been stripped from the lexicon. For over half a century, the economic bond between the United States and Canada served as the global gold standard, a masterclass in how two sovereign nations could create a seamless, integrated, and mutually prosperous ecosystem. This was a relationship defined by just-in-time supply chains and a shared democratic vision that was once the envy of the world. But as of today, that era hasn't just ended. It has been unceremoniously dismantled, leaving the North American trade architecture on life support. The catalyst for this crisis was far more aggressive than a simple request for policy concessions. In a move that caught the global financial community off guard, Donald Trump bypassed traditional diplomatic channels to issue what can only be described as a $500 billion invoice to Canada. This wasn't a proposal for a 10-year phased adjustment or a request for a seat at the table to discuss modernizing trade. It was a demand for immediate liquid compensation. The White House is effectively calling for a massive wealth transfer through a combination of forced market access, sweeping resource guarantees, and what the administration's inner circle is labeling as historic balance of trade corrections. To put the audacity of this move into perspective, it was the geopolitical equivalent of a longtime neighbor suddenly knocking on your door at breakfast, claiming you've been underpaying rent for the last 30 years, and handing you a bill for the difference with an expectation of instant payment. This ultimatum strikes at the heart of Canadian sovereignty and threatens to upend the delicate balance of the integrated North American economy. By framing the relationship through the lens of a debtor and a creditor, the U.S. administration has fundamentally recharacterized a partnership built on trust as a transaction built on grievance. The demand for $500 billion represents a staggering percentage of Canada's annual GDP, making it an existential threat rather than a mere fiscal hurdle. It signals a shift from America first to a more predatory America-only economic posture, where long-standing allies are treated as sources of revenue rather than strategic partners. The frictionless border that once allowed for the effortless movement of goods and services is now overshadowed by the threat of total economic decoupling, leaving businesses on both sides of the 49th parallel staring into a void of unprecedented uncertainty. The White House's expectation for a polite, deferential retreat from Ottawa was rooted in a decades-old assumption that Canada would always prioritize continental stability over sovereign pride. They anticipated the usual diplomatic script, a concerned statement, a call for dialogue, and a quiet concession behind closed doors. Instead, they ran directly into the calculated, unflinching wall that is Mark Carney. Carney did not merely decline the $500 billion demand. He subjected it to a public strategic vivisection that stripped away the populist veneer to reveal a lack of fundamental economic logic. By effectively tearing up the bill on the global stage, he signaled that the era of Canadian passivity in the face of U.S. protectionism was officially over. This wasn't an emotional outburst, it was a cold, institutional rejection that sent a seismic shockwave through every embassy, central bank, and trading floor in the Western world, redefining Canada's role from a junior partner to a defiant middle power willing to forge its own path. Carney's counterstrike was as much about intellectual dominance as it was about political posturing. He didn't just reject the $500 billion figure as fantasy accounting, he dismantled the entire worldview that treats a trade deficit like a personal debt. While the Trump administration scrambled to reclaim the narrative through social media broadsides, Carney moved with the precision of a central banker, framing the dispute as a choice between a rules-based international order and a world of fortresses. His performance at the podium in Ottawa, and later in high-profile international forums like Davos, left the administration's trade team looking ill-prepared and reactive. While cable news pundits were busy dissecting the Twitter war, Carney was already on the phone with leaders in Brussels, Tokyo, and Canberra, building a coalition that isolated Washington rather than Ottawa. He essentially unplugged the leverage the US thought it held, leaving the White House staring at a foundation that was no longer as stable as they had assumed. The sheer audacity of Carney's refusal to be bullied has fundamentally redrawn the economic map of North America. By calling out the US administration's bluster and pivoting Canada toward a strategic autonomy that includes deepened ties with India and a more nuanced engagement with China, He has forced Washington to confront the reality that its closest neighbor has other options. This shift has left the so-called experts in the DC bubble completely missing the forest for the trees. They are watching the personalities while Carney is rewriting the systems. He has proved that precision and preparation can outweigh brute force, and in doing so, he has placed the ball firmly back in the White House's court, forcing a scramble for a strategy that doesn't involve the total collapse of the North American supply chain. In a world where economic coercion has become a weapon of choice, Mark Carney has provided a blueprint for how a middle power can not only survive but thrive by saying no. His dismantling of the $500 billion ultimatum was more than a trade defense. It was a declaration of independence that will likely be studied for decades as the moment the North American power dynamic shifted permanently. The $500 billion figure that captured headlines this morning was never meant to be a reflection of sober economic reality. It was a number forged in the fires of political frustration and populist theater. For months, the Trump administration has been aggressively targeting Canadian staples, timber, energy, and metals, narrating a story of American victimization at the hands of its northern neighbor. The invoice wasn't the result of a standard audit, but rather a carefully curated wish list compiled by a White House team that aggregated every perceived trade imbalance, every regulatory asymmetry, and every market restriction into a single staggering total. By padding the numbers and inflating timelines, they arrived at a figure designed specifically for impact, a number large enough to dominate the news cycle and satisfy a base hungry for tough-on-trade rhetoric. In the world of professional economics, treating a trade deficit like a past-due credit card bill is a fundamental category error. Deficits are complex, shifting currents of capital and demand, often reflecting the strength of the American consumer rather than a theft by a foreign power. However, Trump has always prioritized the optic over the technical. To him, the $500 billion wasn't a data point to be debated, but a branding tool used to frame Canada as a freeloader, finally being held to account. The White House strategy was built on the assumption that the sheer scale of the demand, delivered with the signature velocity of a Truth Social post, would induce a state of paralysis in Ottawa. They bet on the idea that the sticker shock alone would force a quick, desperate round of concessions. The fatal error in this calculation, however, was a total misread of the current Canadian leadership. The administration operated on an outdated playbook, assuming they were dealing with a predictable political class that would fold under the pressure of market volatility and social media broadsides. They didn't anticipate that Mark Carney would view the $500 billion demand not as a fiscal obstacle, but as a strategic opening. By treating the ultimatum as fantasy accounting, Carney effectively devalued the White House's primary weapon, fear. Instead of the expected retreat, the Trump team found themselves locked in a battle with a man who understands the global financial architecture better than anyone in the Oval Office. The tough guy tactic, which has worked in real estate and reality TV, has now hit a wall of institutional resilience that doesn't care about headlines. As the dust settled from Mark Carney's press conference where he famously declared Canada a partner, not a landlord, the global markets began issuing their own verdict. The data revealed 4 distinct receipts that proved Washington may have significantly overplayed its hand in this 2026 trade showdown. Receipt 1. The bond market spiked. Within an hour of Carney's defiant no, U.S. Treasury yields surged, signaling a sharp uptick in market volatility. Investors didn't interpret the $500 billion ultimatum as a sign of American strength. They saw a reckless gamble that threatened to blow up the world's most critical bilateral trade relationship for the sake of a campaign slogan. As institutional capital sought safety, the yield curve steepened, reflecting fears that a prolonged trade war would reignite inflation and force a massive rethink of North American fiscal stability. The message from the bond vigilantes was clear. Reckless trade policy carries a high price for American borrowing. Receipt 2. The auto sector meltdown. The U.S. auto industry isn't merely national, it is a deeply integrated continental machine. Because parts cross the border up to 8 times during assembly, the threat of a 50% tariff sent Ford, GM, and Stellantis stocks into a tailspin, with some losing over 4% in a single afternoon. These tariffs don't just punish Ottawa, they effectively dismantle the supply chains of Michigan, Ohio, and Indiana. Industry analysts warned that such a levy would immediately spike vehicle prices by as much as 25%, making made-in-America cars unaffordable at home and uncompetitive abroad. By targeting Canada, Washington inadvertently aimed an economic weapon at its own industrial heartland. Receipt 3. The Energy Card. Canada remains the primary lifeblood of American energy security, supplying more crude oil to the US than all of OPEC combined. When Carney noted that Canada would prioritize its own national interests, the market did the math instantly. West Texas Intermediate, WTI crude oil prices jumped $6 a barrel in 90 minutes, and natural gas futures spiked as traders priced in the risk of a resource-starved Midwest. Carney didn't need to threaten a shutoff. Simply reminding the world that Canada controls the taps was enough to trigger a global repricing of American energy costs, hitting US consumers directly at the pump and the heater. Receipt 4. The Global Coalition. Perhaps the most damaging receipt for Washington was the speed with which the rest of the world rallied behind Ottawa. Within hours of the press conference, leaders from the EU, the UK, and Japan issued statements supporting the rules-based international order. Trump's attempt to isolate Canada backfired, instead isolating the United States. Carney successfully framed the dispute as a fight for multilateral principles, turning himself into a global symbol of resistance. This move accelerated the formation of an anti-tariff trade bloc, with Europe and Japan moving to deepen ties with Canada through the CPTP, effectively building an economic pillar that bypasses Washington entirely. To truly understand the stakes of this confrontation, one must recognize that Mark Carney is not operating from the standard political playbook. Unlike career politicians who prioritize the next news cycle, Carney is a systemic thinker whose instincts were forged in the fires of the 2008 financial crisis and the structural collapse of Brexit. He doesn't just read the headlines, he stress tests them. While the White House relies on the high-velocity, high-decibel impact of social media ultimatums, Carney views these as data points in a larger model of financial warfare. He is the first Canadian leader to treat trade not as a series of handshakes, but as a discipline of strategic autonomy. His retaliation strategy was a masterclass in surgical reciprocity. Rather than broad, blunt force tariffs that would inevitably wound the Canadian consumer, Carney leveraged his deep understanding of US domestic politics to place the economic pain precisely where it would do the most damage to the president's coalition. By targeting iconic exports like Kentucky bourbon, Iowa agricultural machinery, and Texas tech components, he bypassed the American public and went straight for the wallets of the Republican senators whose support the president requires. It isn't just a trade dispute, it's a targeted political siege designed to make the $500 billion demand impossibly expensive for the GOP to defend on the Senate floor. The three paths forward. As we move deeper into 2026, the North American economy is entering a period of extreme volatility. We are currently staring down three potential exits to this standoff, each with radically different consequences for every household in the hemisphere. The standoff. In this scenario, both leaders dig in for a war of attrition. The border slows to a crawl as security inspections become a tool of economic friction. Supply chains across the Midwest begin to seize up, and the auto sector starts bleeding thousands of jobs a week. Eventually, as the stock market begins to price in a permanent rupture, a panicked Congress and the Canadian business elite force a messy, face-saving compromise. It won't be a win for either side, but it will stop the bleeding before the patient flatlines. The spiral. This is the nightmare scenario. If the White House views Carney's precision as an insult, the president could double down, invoking emergency powers to block Canadian energy imports or deploying troops to the border under the guise of national security. Canada would respond by fully activating its new trade bridge with the EU and China, pivoting its energy exports to Asia through the Trans Mountain Pipeline. The result would be a self-inflicted continental recession, $7 per gallon gas at American pumps, and a 20% drop in the markets. A crisis triggered by one man's refusal to back down from a number he made up. The quiet retreat. Behind the scenes, the adults in the room, the Treasury Secretary or a back-channel envoy, quietly reach out to Ottawa. They negotiate a deal that allows the president to claim he secured billions in concessions, even if the math is creative, while Carney maintains Canada's sovereignty and prevents the $500 billion invoice from ever being paid. The markets calm, the tariffs are quietly mothballed, and both nations return to the status quo, pretending the relationship wasn't just pushed to the brink of a total breakdown.